I remember the doors more clearly than the faces. They were taller than any gate I had seen in the hive, slabs of blackened adamantine etched with litanies so dense they looked like scars rather than scripture. Servo motors growled as the vault opened, the sound vibrating through my chest and teeth, as if the fortress itself were warning us away. Cold air spilled out, heavy with incense, machine oil, and something older, dust that had never known sunlight. When I crossed the threshold, I felt it immediately, the sense that even my breath was being recorded. We were not marched in. We were processed. Each of us was halted beneath a cogitator shrine, where robed scribes waited with slates and stylus needles. They did not ask our names. Names were temporary things. They asked for confirmation of origin, genetic compliance markers, devotional history. Every answer was checked against a data stream that whispered softly from the shrine, a chorus of approval tones and warning chimes. When someone hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, the scribe marked the slate and nodded to an unseen watcher. That recruit did not proceed with us. I never saw him again. The chamber beyond the doors was vast and oppressive, a cathedral built for secrets rather than worship. Pillars rose into shadow, their surfaces carved with prayers so worn they had become texture rather than text. Chains hung between them, thick and ceremonial, each link etched with symbols of obedience. Lumen globes cast a pale, sterile light that never reached the corners. Sound behaved strangely there, footsteps muted, voices flattened, as if the room itself refused to echo anything back. We were told to kneel. The stone was colder than expected, leaching warmth from my legs until pain replaced sensation. I welcomed it. Pain was familiar. It meant I was still myself. Around me other recruits shifted slightly, trying to find purchase on the unforgiving floor. No one spoke. Silence was the first lesson, and it was enforced without words. A figure emerged from the far end of the hall, robed and hooded, accompanied by the soft whir of servo skulls. They floated above us, optics glowing faintly as they adjusted focus. I felt exposed like an insect pinned for study. The figure did not announce himself. Authority here did not require introduction. "The oaths you will take," he said, his voice amplified and flattened by hidden vox emitters. "Hair not for honor." That surprised me. I had grown up on stories, tales whispered in hab blocks about glorious warriors, about valor and sacrifice. Honor had been the currency of my dreams. To hear it dismissed so casually felt like a small betrayal. "They are not for glory," the figure continued. "They are not for remembrance. They are for containment." The words settled over us like ash. Scribes stepped forward, their movements precise, rehearsed. One by one we were instructed to speak, not loudly, not proudly. Each vow was to be delivered in a controlled tone, measured for consistency. As I spoke, the words placed before me, phrases about obedience, loyalty, endurance. I became acutely aware of the way my voice sounded in my own skull. Too much emotion would be noted. Too little would be suspicious. I aimed for empty steadiness. As I finished, a stylus pricked my thumb, blood-welled, dark and warm, and was drawn into a vial marked with my provisional designation. The scribe watched the vial carefully as it sealed, then compared it to the slate. A chime sounded. Approval. I exhaled slowly, only then realizing I had been holding my breath. Others were not so fortunate. One recruit's voice trembled during the vow. Barely perceptible, but enough. The scribe paused, eyes flicking to the slate. The servo skulls adjusted, their lenses narrowing. The figure at the front raised a hand, not in anger, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. Enforcers emerged from the shadows, silent and efficient. The trembling recruit was lifted to his feet and guided away. He did not resist. Resistance would have confirmed whatever fear they had already logged. When it was done, fewer of us remained. We were told to stand and face the walls. Only then did I see the carvings properly. Endless lines of text, prayers layered over prayers, names scratched out and replaced by symbols. Some sections were polished smooth, as if generations of hands had traced the same words again and again. Others were gouged, defaced deliberately. I realized those were not acts of vandalism. They were corrections. "Everything you need to know is written here," the robed figure said. "Everything you are not permitted to know has been removed." No one asked which was which. We were led deeper into the fortress, through corridors that narrowed and widened without pattern. Doors sealed behind us with final, echoing booms. The air grew warmer, more humid, carrying the tang of recycled breath and sacred oils. At intervals, we passed sealed chambers marked with warning sigils that made my eyes ache to linger on. I felt an irrational urge to memorize them, to catalogue their shapes and meanings. The urge frightened me. I forced my gaze forward. Our quarters were Spartan cells carved directly into the stone, each containing a cot, a shrine niche, and a lectern bolted to the floor. On the lectern lay a single book, its cover unmarked. When I opened it, the pages were filled with the same litanies carved into the walls: obedience, silence, endurance, repeated until they blurred together. No history, no explanation, just rules without context. That night, as the fortress settled into its nocturnal rhythms, the distant hum of generators, the faint clang of chains shifting, I lay awake on the cot, staring at the low ceiling. My muscles ached. My throat felt raw from speaking the vows. In the quiet, I realized something unsettling. I could not remember the exact words I had sworn. Only the feeling remained, heavy and binding. The next cycle, training began immediately. Physical trials, endurance tests, drills that pushed us past exhaustion and into something colder and more obedient. But even then, it was clear that strength was not the primary metric. Instructors watched our reactions more than our performance. A question asked at the wrong moment earned a look that lingered too long. A glance toward a sealed door was noted. I learned quickly that questions were punished more harshly than failure. Failure could be corrected. Questions implied curiosity, and curiosity led to places the fortress had been designed to seal away. When an instructor paused mid-lesson, eyes flicking toward a symbol etched high on the wall, we were expected to forget the topic instantly. To continue as if the pause had never happened. Those who did not, who hesitated, who looked confused, were summoned for private guidance. They returned changed, quieter, or they did not return at all. The true rule was never written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It settled into us through omission and fear, through the careful shaping of what we were allowed to remember. I began to understand that we were not being taught secrets. We were being taught how to live around them. By the end of the first cycle, I no longer felt the urge to ask why certain corridors were sealed or why certain names were never spoken. The fear had done its work. It had replaced curiosity with caution, pride with vigilance. I had come seeking purpose and found something colder and more durable. I had come to serve, and service here meant learning to fear what I did not yet understand, because one day I might understand too much. Training did not begin with weapons. It began with subtraction. They stripped away the small, stubborn parts of me that still believed learning was a straight line: lesson, practice, mastery. In the fortress monastery, learning was a corridor that ended in sealed doors. You were allowed to walk until the locks began, and then you were expected to forget the hallway existed. The days were measured by bells that sounded like iron being struck against bone. At the first chime, we rose from our cots in unison, our bare feet meeting stone so cold it numbed thought. We washed in recycled water that smelled faintly of metal and antiseptic, then assembled in the training nave where lumen globes hung like pale moons, watching without warmth. The air always carried incense, but not the sweet kind that soothed. This incense burned sharp, biting the throat, reminding you that the fortress was alive with rituals older than your bloodline and far less forgiving. Our instructors were not loud. They didn't need to shout. Their authority pressed down like gravity. They spoke in short, clipped phrases and expected immediate obedience, not because obedience was glorious, but because hesitation could be measured. And in this place, anything measurable could be used against you. We ran until our lungs felt scraped raw. We fought with blunted blades until bruises darkened under our skin like ink stains. We recited doctrine while muscles trembled from exhaustion, because they wanted to see what broke first, body or discipline. If you faltered in combat, you were corrected with pain. If you faltered in recitation, you were corrected with something worse: silence. The gaps began to show during the lectures. Between drills, we were marched to instruction chambers where old picked screens flickered with campaign footage and doctrinal diagrams. The instructors spoke of strategy in the language of inevitability: advance, purge, secure. They described war like accounting, a matter of balancing losses against necessity. We took notes on slates bolted to the desks, our hands cramped from writing in precise block script. The details were brutal but straightforward. Kill zones, breach points, casualty tolerances. The Imperium's cruelty at least was consistent. Then, sometimes, the lesson would stop. An instructor would be explaining an historical maneuver, tracing a line across a map, when his voice would catch, just for a breath. His gaze would lift to a symbol carved high on the wall, half hidden by shadow. The room would go still, as if even the air recyclers held their breath. He would lower his hand, clear his throat, and continue with a different topic as if nothing had happened. No one asked why. The first time it happened, I felt the question rise in me like bile. What was that? Why did he stop? I swallowed it down so hard my throat burned. Around me, other recruits stared at their slates with exaggerated focus, pretending they hadn't noticed. That was the lesson. Noticing was dangerous, but being seen noticing was fatal. The gaps were not accidental. They were deliberate trenches dug through our education. We learned certain histories in fragments, campaigns referenced but not detailed, victories mentioned but never attributed, enemies described without names. When someone asked an innocent question, which commander led that action? The instructor's expression didn't change, but the room temperature seemed to drop. He answered with a phrase that sounded rehearsed. Attribution is irrelevant. Outcome is doctrinal. The recruit who asked was called out after the session. They referred to it as counseling. A servo skull drifted in and hovered over the recruit's shoulder, projecting a tiny rune onto his slate. He Amber. He looked at it, then at us, eyes wide with the sudden understanding that his curiosity had been logged. He tried to laugh, a weak sound that died immediately. No one responded. Even sympathy felt dangerous. The instructors watched us all as he left, as if measuring who would remember. He returned the next day. He was the same shape, the same uniform, the same face, but emptied. His gaze no longer searched the room. His shoulders held a new stiffness, like a man who had been strapped into a frame and taught that moving wrong would hurt. When the instructor paused again mid-lesson, the recruit didn't even blink. It was as if the gap had been cauterized out of him. After that, disappearances started, not dramatic ones, no alarms, no shouted accusations, just an absence at roll call, a bunk left empty, a name quietly removed from the roster slate. Our training sergeant would glance at the list, tap a stylus once, and move on without acknowledging the missing designation. The first time it happened, a recruit beside me whispered, "Where is he?" The sergeant's head turned slowly toward the whisperer, not with anger but with mild curiosity, like a scientist observing a flawed specimen. "What name?" the sergeant asked. The whisperer froze, his mouth opened, then closed. He looked down at his boots and said nothing. The sergeant stared for a long moment, then turned away. The message was clear. If you insisted on remembering, you could become what was forgotten. I began to understand that training here was as much about memory as muscle. They taught us to fight. Yes, how to clear corridors, how to hold a line under fire, how to kill efficiently in cramped spaces. But beneath every drill was an invisible lesson: control your mind, control what you retain, control what you ask. They were shaping not just warriors, but containers, bodies built to hold secrets without leaking them through speech, expression, or hesitation. The fortress help. It was designed like a labyrinth of deliberate ignorance. Corridors ended in locked doors. Windows were rare and narrow, offering only slivers of sky that looked wrong, as if the outside world was an illusion. You could walk the same route 100 times and still not know what lay behind the sealed bulkheads you passed. Everything was segmented. Everything was compartmentalized. Even the meals were part of it. We ate in silence under murals depicting faceless warriors kneeling before a blank icon. The food was dense nutrient bricks that tasted of ash and preservative oils. Conversation was not forbidden explicitly, but the watchers made it unnecessary. Servo skulls drifted between tables, lenses whirring softly. If someone spoke, the skull would hover closer, recording. The speakers would lower their voices, then stop. Silence became habit. Habit became safety. One night, I woke to muffled sounds in the corridor, bootsteps, the soft clink of chains. I sat up, heart hammering, and listened. A door down the hall opened with a hiss. A voice murmured something too low to hear. Then the sound of a struggle, brief, stifled, as if someone had been trained not to make noise. The corridor fell silent again. In the morning, the recruit from that cell was gone. No one mentioned it. No one asked. Later that cycle, during a weapons drill, an instructor handed me a bolt gun with reverence that felt performative. "This is your purpose," he said, "to deliver judgment." I nodded and accepted it, feeling the weapon's weight settle into my hands like destiny. But as I looked down the firing range at the target's silhouettes, featureless, anonymous, I realized something chilling. They were teaching me to deliver judgment without ever knowing who deserved it. Outcome was doctrinal. Attribution irrelevant. The same principle applied to enemies, to civilians, to brothers who vanished in the night, to myself. By the end of the week, I caught myself doing it automatically, looking away when an instructor paused, swallowing questions before they formed, pretending not to notice the empty bunks. It wasn't courage. It was conditioning. The fortress didn't need to threaten us openly. It simply rewarded those who learned to forget, and beneath that conditioning, a new fear took root, not fear of death, or pain, or failure. Those were simple. Manageable, I began to fear knowing, because knowledge here wasn't a gift, it was a weight, and weights were assigned carefully. If you reached for one not meant for you, the system corrected you, quietly, permanently. We were not being forged into warriors alone. We were being forged into containers, sealed, compartmentalized, and trained to carry the chapter's unspoken lessons without ever letting them spill into the light. They did not call it a mission briefing. They called it a procedural deployment orientation, which should have been my first warning that this was not the kind of war I had trained for. We stood in a narrow chamber beneath the fortress, armored and silent, while a robed officer read from a slate without looking at us. The chamber smelled of cold metal and sacred oils, the air thick enough to taste. Behind him, a hololithic projection flickered, fractured images of a ruined structure, scorched ground, and something that had once been a battlefield. No enemy icons were highlighted, no threat designations blinked, just debris, ash, and timestamps. Our objective, the officer said, is site sanitation, not engagement, not pacification, sanitation. The words settled uneasily in my mind. Orders arrived sealed in layers. Each instruction required confirmation by 2 separate officers, each confirmation logged and time-stamped. We were reminded repeatedly that deviation from procedure would be treated as contamination. That language again. As if mistakes here were not tactical errors, but infections. We deployed without ceremony. The transport's interior was cramped and dark, lit only by red lumen strips that painted everything the color of dried blood. The engines vibrated through my armor, a constant reminder of motion and inevitability. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Even excitement felt inappropriate, like noise in a shrine. When the ramp lowered, the smell hit first. Burned promethium, charred stone, ozone, and something organic beneath it all. The smell of bodies left too long in the open. The site had been a structure once, perhaps a command center or a place of significance. Now it was a hollowed carcass. Walls collapsed inward, floors buckled and scorched. Wind moved through the ruins with a low, mournful sound, carrying ash that settled on our armor like gray snow. There were bodies everywhere, not arranged as fallen soldiers usually are, not scattered in the chaos of battle, but positioned strangely, as if death had come too quickly for resistance. Some were armored, some not. Some bore markings I didn't recognize, symbols half burned into flesh or cloth. Others wore uniforms that looked imperial, or close enough to make my stomach tighten. No one commented. We moved as instructed, methodical and precise. Auspex scans first, visual confirmation second, then eradication. Bodies were incinerated where they lay, reduced to nothing but blackened residue. Wreckage was dismantled, critical components crushed or melted beyond recovery. Data, slates, banners, even stone reliefs were destroyed if they bore certain patterns. Those patterns were never explained. We were simply told to eliminate them. At one point, I found myself standing before a shattered wall where a symbol had been carved deep into the stone. The flames had licked at it, but not erased it completely. I stared for a moment longer than necessary, tracing the lines with my eyes. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of my memory from training lectures that had ended too abruptly. My helm chimed softly. Dilu DT'd. I acted immediately. I raised my weapon and fired until the wall collapsed inward, stone pulverized into dust. The recoil jolted my arms, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. When the noise faded, nothing recognizable remained. The chiming stopped. That was my first lie. I logged the destruction as routine sanitation, no anomalies observed. I did not note the moment of hesitation. I did not record the recognition I almost allowed myself to feel. I sealed the report with a steady hand, my thumbprint clean and compliant. As we worked, I began to understand the true nature of the operation. We were not erasing enemies. We were erasing evidence. Every action was documented with obsessive care, as if the real battle were not here in the ruins, but somewhere in an archive where these logs would be reviewed and cross-referenced. The officers overseeing the operation spoke in low tones, constantly checking timestamps and confirmation codes. At one point, an incineration was delayed by 30 seconds because an authorization ping lagged. The body waited. Procedure did not. I caught glimpses of things we were not meant to linger on, burned remains of picked recorders, data, coils fused into slag, a broken helm bearing a sigil that made my chest tighten with a sense of wrongness I couldn't articulate. Each time, instinct urged me to look away, to trust that someone higher in the chain understood what was being done. Trust was easier than knowing. Near the end of the operation, we found survivors. They were civilians, huddled in a collapsed lower chamber, their skin gray with dust and fear. They looked at us with a mixture of hope and terror, mouths opening to speak. Before they could, an officer raised his hand. There was a pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Orders were reviewed. Seals confirmed. The decision arrived without words. The civilians were executed quickly, efficiently. Their bodies were burned with the rest. The report listed them as secondary contamination vectors. I did not protest. I did not question. I logged it as required. As the transport lifted us away, I looked back at the site through the small viewport. From above, it already looked clean. Just another scarred patch of ground in a galaxy full of them. No sign remained of what had happened there, or why. Back in the fortress, the debrief was brief. We stood at attention while a robed official reviewed our logs. His stylus paused once over my report, hovering just long enough for my pulse to spike. Then it moved on. Approval chimed. The mission was archived under a designation that meant nothing to me. That night, in my cell, I removed my helm and stared at my reflection in the polished metal of the lectern. My face looked the same, younger than I felt. My eyes, however, seemed darker, as if something had taken root behind them. I realized then that the fear I carried was no longer about dying. It was about learning the wrong detail, because now I understood the real danger. It wasn't enemies who could kill me. It was information, symbols, names, connections. Anything that might bridge the gaps they had carved into my training. I had crossed an invisible line on that mission. Not because I had disobeyed, but because I had understood enough to lie correctly. The Imperium does not punish lies when they serve containment. It rewards them, and I had been rewarded. That was when I knew there was no return to ignorance. Only deeper silence, heavier secrets, and more lies dressed as duty. That was my first mission. And that was the moment I learned how this chapter truly fought its wars. They called it a chapel, but it was built like a cage. The summons came at the end of the cycle, delivered on a slate that locked itself after I read it. No explanation, only a time code and a location designation that did not exist on any map I was permitted to access. The slate's final line was a reminder written in the language of mercy et dedans esse villagi. I stared at that sentence for a long moment, tasting its meaning like something bitter on the tongue. In the fortress, you never refused. Refusal wasn't defiance, it was self-identification. A neat clerical tag attached to your soul, unreliable. I arrived early because I could not risk being late. The corridor that led to the chapel narrowed into a throat of stone and iron. The lights here were dim, not flickering like the barracks lumens, but steady and subdued, as if bright illumination would offend whatever was done beyond the doors. The air changed as I walked, less incense, more antiseptic, the sharp scent of sterilized instruments and recirculated breath. My boots sounded too loud. Each step felt like a signature on a form I hadn't read. The doors were not carved with litanies. They were plain, heavy, and sealed with warning sigils that made my eyes ache if I stared directly at them. A servo skull hovered above the threshold, its lens trained on my face. It clicked softly as it recognized my designation. Somewhere inside the wall, a lock disengaged with a sound like a bone snapping clean. The doors opened. The chamber beyond was long and narrow, built like a nave but stripped of comfort. The floor was black stone polished to a dull sheen. Rows of metal benches lined the sides, empty and bolted down, as if the room expected an audience but did not trust one. At the far end stood an altar not of gold or marble, but of steel and plasteel, its surface crowded with cogitator terminals, data spools and prayer strips sealed under glass. Above it hung an icon of authority, faceless and severe, its edges softened by centuries of smoke and whispered confession. The chapel smelled wrong. Incense was present, but it was mixed with ozone and machine heat, and beneath that a faint copper tang that made my mouth water unpleasantly. There was a hum in the air, low, constant, like a device that never truly powered down. A robed figure waited beside the altar. Another sat behind it, half hidden by the terminals. Their hoods were deep enough to conceal faces. Their voices, when they spoke, were calm. "Step forward," one said. I obeyed. At the center of the chapel stood a chair, metal, angular, built for function rather than comfort. Straps hung from its arms and legs. A metal collar rested open at the back like a waiting mouth. I had seen chairs like this in medical bays, but those were used to keep patients still. This one was used to keep truth still. "Sit," the voice said gently, as if offering rest. I sat. Cold bit through my uniform immediately. The chair leached heat from my body with eager efficiency. Straps came alive with a soft wear, tightening around my wrists and ankles. The collar closed around my neck with a click that sounded final. I tried not to swallow. The collar's edge pressed against my throat, reminding me that even involuntary movement could be interpreted as resistance. A servo skull drifted closer, projecting a thin beam of light across my eyes. I blinked once, slowly. The beam tracked the blink. Somewhere, a cogitator chimed approvingly, as if pleased I remained predictable. "Do not fear," the robed figure said, and the lie was so practiced it almost sounded sincere. "This is guidance. Guidance, counseling, harmonization, consolidation." The Imperium had 1,000 words for coercion, each one shaped like kindness. A terminal screen flickered to life on the altar, displaying my designation string, my training metrics, my mission logs. The pages of my first deployment report unfolded in neat lines, sealed and time-stamped. My throat tightened. Seeing my own words presented like evidence made them feel foreign, as if someone else had written them through my hands. The first question was soft. During site sanitation, the interrogator said, "Did you observe anomalies?" "No," I answered immediately. The cogitator emitted a small tone, not approval, a note. A second voice joined, quieter, closer to my ear. "Define anomaly." My mouth went dry. This was how they worked, never accusing, only refining, narrowing, making you trap yourself with precision. I forced my voice steady. Unauthorized symbols, unregistered tech patterns, survivors not listed in operation parameters. A pause, the cogitator tone again, like a pen scratching. "And did you observe any of those?" the first interrogator asked. "No," I repeated. A longer pause. The servo skull's beam shifted slightly, tracing the edges of my pupils as if measuring dilation. The collar at my throat tightened a fraction. Not enough to choke. "Clarity is a form of devotion." The voice near my ear murmured, "Mu seek clarity." Clarity. In this place, clarity was not something you possessed. It was something extracted. A new device descended from the ceiling with a soft mechanical sigh. An array of thin needles and sensor filaments, ending in polished metal nodes. They hovered near my temples, my jaw, the base of my skull. I could feel their cold presence without them touching me, as if the air itself grew sharper around them. The interrogator's tone remained calm. "We will proceed with doctrinal alignment." My heart hammered once, hard enough that I worried it would register as panic. A hymn began. Not sung, but recited by a Vox speaker embedded in the wall. The voice was monotonous, rhythmic, unfeeling. It spoke the words of obedience and purity the way a machine recites calibration steps. As it spoke, the metal nodes touched my skin, gentle contact, then a brief sting. A pulse traveled through my head, bright and nauseating, as if someone had struck the inside of my skull with a tuning fork. My vision blurred for a moment, then returned sharper than before. The interrogators watched. The cogitators listened. Repeat the litany of silence, one said. I obeyed, forcing each word out in correct cadence. The collar pressed against my throat as I spoke, measuring vibration, perhaps, or the micro-hesitations between syllables. The pulse came again, stronger this time, making my teeth ache and my stomach clench. Again, they said. I repeated it. They did this for an hour, maybe more. Time dissolved into sensation: cold chair, tight straps, the taste of copper, the hum of machines, the relentless hymn, voice in the walls. Between repetitions, they asked questions, not about tactics, not about combat, but about my mind. What did you feel when you saw the ruins? What thoughts came unbidden when you observed the dead? Did you experience recognition? Recognition. The words slid into me like a blade seeking a gap. No, I said, and felt the lie settle in my chest like a stone. The pulse struck again. This one was different, not painful exactly, but invasive. A crawling sensation behind my eyes, like fingers turning pages inside my skull. My breath hitched. The interrogator's voice remained gentle. You hesitate, he observed. I do not, I replied quickly, too quickly. The cogitator chimed sharp, the voice near my ear lowered. Your body is a ledger, it whispered. It records what you deny. That was when I understood the true function of the interrogation chapel. It was not a place where guilt was punished. It was a place where ambiguity was eradicated. They did not need to catch heresy. They needed to ensure I could carry silence without leaking it through reflex or emotion. Confession here was not forgiveness. It was maintenance. The questions tightened like screws. They replayed my mission footage, helmet, cam records projected in pale light across the far wall. I watched myself move through the ruins, methodical, compliant. I watched the moment I had paused before the symbol. The projection froze on that frame. My helmet angled toward the carved lines. Explain this delay, the interrogator said. My mouth went numb. I could hear my own heart in my ears, loud as gunfire in that quiet chamber. I assessed structural instability, I said. Potential collapse hazard. The cogitator tone was long, skeptical. A pulse hit my temples hard enough to make tears spring to my eyes. I blinked them away, not out of pride, but fear that tears might be interpreted as emotional deviation, structural instability. The voice near my ear repeated, almost kindly. And yet you fired, excessively. I swallowed carefully against the collar. To remove hazard, I said. They let the silence stretch. In that silence, I could hear the machines, fans spinning, relays clicking, the faint hiss of recycled air. I could also hear something else, the thin, distant murmur of other voices, as if other confessions were happening behind other sealed walls, overlapping like prayers in a cathedral of fear. Finally, the interrogator spoke again. Do you know why this chapel exists? I did not answer. Answers invited follow-ups. It exists, he continued, because loyalty is not a feeling. It is a condition. Conditions require monitoring. The straps tightened imperceptibly, as if agreeing. We do not seek to punish you, he said. We seek to preserve you. Preserve, like paper in preservative oil, like relics sealed behind glass, like secrets stored in flesh. The pulses continued in measured intervals. They made me recite. They made me answer. They made me repeat my own denials until the lies felt smoother than truth. Each time I insisted I had seen nothing. The cogitator registered my tone, my breathing, my minute shifts against the straps. Each time the interrogators adjusted, less like judges, more like technicians tuning an instrument. By the end, my voice was hoarse and my thoughts felt scraped thin. When they finally released me, the straps loosened with a soft hiss. The collar opened. Warm blood rushed back into my wrists and ankles, pins and needles flaring painfully. I stood on unsteady legs. The interrogator stepped closer. I could not see his face beneath the hood, but I could feel his gaze like pressure. You are improving, he said, improving. As if I were a component being calibrated. He placed something in my hand, a small metal token stamped with a sigil I had never seen in the open halls. It was smooth, cold, and heavier than it should have been. "Carry this," he said. "It will remind you to be careful." I understood what it really meant. You have been marked. I left the chapel with my head lowered, the token hidden in my fist. The corridor outside felt brighter, louder, yet also more dangerous, because now I knew what waited behind sealed doors. The fortress had always watched, but this was different. This was intimate. This was invasive. Back in my cell, I washed my face with cold water and watched it run grey down the drain. My hands shook slightly as I dried them. I stared at my reflection in the metal lectern and tried to recall my thoughts during the mission, the exact sensation of recognition before I destroyed the symbol. The memory felt blurred at the edges, not gone, but softened, rounded off. Maintenance. That night, I recited the litany of silence until my tongue went numb. Not because I believed it would protect me, but because I feared what would happen if my mind wandered into the gaps again. I could still taste copper at the back of my throat. I could still feel the phantom pressure of the collar. And in the darkness, as the fortress hummed around me, I understood the cruelty of it. They did not need me to be pure. They needed me to be containable. To carry what I had seen without thinking about it the wrong way. To learn that confession here was not absolution, it was calibration. After the interrogation chapel, I learned a new way to breathe, not deeper, never deeper. Deep breathing draws attention to itself. I learned to breathe evenly, as if my lungs were part of a machine cycle. Inhale on the count, exhale on the count, no tremor, no hitch. The token they had placed in my hand stayed in my pouch like a small, cold heartbeat, reminding me that my body was a ledger and my mind an account to be audited. Life in the fortress continued as if nothing had happened. That is how the chapter survives, by treating trauma like routine, by turning fear into schedule. We rose with the bells, drilled until our muscles shook, ate in silence under watchful optics, and slept in cells that smelled of stone, oil, and old incense. Yet something had changed in me, and once it changes, you begin seeing it in others too, subtle signs, hidden reactions that are only obvious when you're already looking for them. The first change was in how we spoke. Before the chapel, recruits whispered sometimes, quick exchanges about bruises, training pain, crude jokes about the thin gruel in the refectory. After, I noticed how quickly those whispers died. Words became careful, clipped, wrapped in the same safe phrases instructors used. We stopped using names in private even when we were alone. Names create intimacy. Intimacy creates witnesses. Witnesses create vulnerability, so we called each other by designation or by function. Brother. Recruit. You. It made the world smaller and colder but safer. I tried at first to keep something human alive. I did. There was a recruit I shared drills with. A broad, shouldered man from an mining hab who had never learned to hide his thoughts properly. He would grit his teeth and mutter curses when instructors weren't listening, like the old life still clung to him. One evening, after a particularly brutal endurance run, he sat beside me in the corridor, back against the stone, sweat cooling under his collar. "They watch too much," he whispered, not looking at me as if even eye contact was an admission. No one fights like this in the stories. I felt my blood turn cold. Not because I disagreed, but because he had said it aloud. "Quiet," I breathed. He laughed softly, a sound that died immediately when a servo skull drifted closer down the corridor, its lens word focusing. We fell silent, staring at the floor until it passed. When it was gone, the recruit's jaw tightened. "You see," he said, almost soundlessly. "We can't even talk." I looked at him then, and I saw the danger in his face, not heresy, not rebellion, loose edges. The kind of humanity that doesn't seal itself properly. The kind that leaks. I should have distanced myself right then. The correct move, the safe move, would have been to treat him as a risk and keep my thoughts contained. Instead, I made the mistake of caring. I placed my hand briefly on his shoulder, just a quick, reassuring touch. "Endure," I said. "That's all." He nodded. For a moment, we were almost brothers in the way I'd imagined brotherhood might feel. The next cycle, his bunk was empty, no alarm, no announcement, no name struck from the roster because the roster had never held names, only designations, and designations are easy to reassign. At roll call, the instructor's stylus paused once over the slate, then tapped a correction rune. The count continued. The gap was sealed with procedure. I did not ask where he went. I felt the question rise in my throat like bile, and I swallowed it until it burned. I understood then that friendship here was not merely discouraged. It was structurally unsafe. If you get close to someone, you notice when they vanish. If you notice, you remember, and memory, in this fortress, is a form of disobedience, so we began to become strangers to each other by design. Training intensified, but it wasn't only physical. We were taught discipline, the way you teach an animal to fear a certain tone, through repetition and consequences. Each recruit was assigned to rotating squads that changed weekly, ensuring no one formed stable bonds. We trained beside one another for days, bleeding and sweating together, then were separated without explanation. It created a steady background anxiety. You never knew who would be beside you tomorrow, or who would be gone. Even the small comforts were regulated. Shared time in the refectory was staggered. Prayer schedules were individualized. Confession intervals varied unpredictably, so you could never anticipate when someone might be called for guidance. The fortress was a machine designed to prevent clusters of knowledge, clusters of loyalty, clusters of shared truth. I watched veterans more closely after that. They moved with a different kind of control. Their armor was worn, their movements economical, their voices low and precise. They did not laugh. They did not speak casually. When they addressed each other, they used formal titles even in private corridors. On the surface, it looked like discipline. Underneath, I began to sense something else, a shared worriness that never fully relaxed. Once, during a weapons maintenance session, I saw it clearly. A veteran knelt by his rifle, hands moving with practiced speed, when a younger warrior approached and asked a question about a campaign referenced in an old doctrinal fragment. The question wasn't even specific, just a curiosity about an old victory. The veteran's hands froze for a fraction of a second. His gaze flicked to the ceiling, as if expecting an unseen lens to tilt. Then he resumed his work, voice calm. "That history is not for discussion," he said. The younger warrior frowned. "But it's in the text." The veteran turned his head slightly. Not angry, not harsh, just final. "Then the text will be corrected." The younger warrior backed away, confused and chastened. The veteran continued cleaning his weapon, but his fingers were tighter now, knuckles pale beneath the gloves. I watched him, and I realized even the veterans feared missteps. Not death, not combat, a wrong sentence, a wrong memory, a wrong emphasis. Fear shaped the chapter more reliably than devotion did. Promotions came, but they didn't feel like honor. They felt like narrowing corridors. When I advanced in rank from recruit status, it was marked by a ceremony conducted in a chamber with no windows. A robed official recited vows while scribes recorded my responses. A new seal was applied to my armor, an insignia that meant nothing outside these walls and everything inside them. Along with it came additional restrictions, new locked sections of the fortress I could not enter, new doctrines I was forbidden to read without supervision, new confessional intervals. My world did not expand. It contracted. With each step upward, the oaths grew less about war and more about silence. Less about courage and more about containment. They gave me more responsibility, but also more chains. My instructors began to speak to me in coded phrases, references that implied knowledge while refusing to share it. Some threats are internal, one told me during a drill, and the internal must be handled with purity. I did not ask what he meant. I only nodded and repeated the safe reply, A's doctrine demands. At night, I began to listen differently in the barracks. The fortress was never quiet. It hummed, it hissed, it clicked, machines cycling, locks engaging, distant chains shifting. But beneath those noises, I started hearing the softer things, a brother's breath catching in sleep, a muffled sob quickly suppressed, the faint scrape of someone kneeling in their cell for longer than required. We were surrounded by men trained to be fearless, and yet fear was everywhere, diffuse, constant, disciplined into shape. It was not fear of enemies. It was fear of what we protected. The chapter was not held together by love or pride. Those were unstable materials. They burn too brightly, draw too much attention. Instead, we were held together by shared caution, mutual surveillance, and the unspoken understanding that every brother could also be a watcher, and the watchers weren't always outsiders. Sometimes, during drills, I would catch a brother's gaze lingering on me a fraction too long, as if measuring my expression for deviation. Sometimes I would notice myself doing it in return. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't betrayal, it was survival logic learned through repetition. Trust is a risk, distance is safety. The worst part was how normal it became. Weeks turned into months, and I stopped expecting warmth. I stopped expecting camaraderie. I learned to bleed beside strangers and call it brotherhood, because the word was required. I learned to speak in half phrases, to bury personal thoughts beneath doctrine, to treat curiosity like a wound that needed immediate cauterization. I became what they wanted, a sealed vessel. But sometimes, rarely, dangerously, I would remember the recruit from the ash mines, his brief laugh, his whispered complaint, the way he vanished without leaving a ripple. And in those moments, I felt the true spine of this chapter's fear, not that the secret would escape to enemies, but that it would escape into us, that we would begin to connect the gaps, to share the missing pieces, to form a complete picture. Because completeness is what the fortress cannot allow. Completeness creates understanding. Understanding creates questions, and questions are a kind of contamination no armor can seal against. So we remained strangers, not because we hated each other, because the chapter demanded it. They told us we were deploying to hunt a quarry. The word sounded clean, righteous, like a sanctioned purge against something alien, something corrupt, something that didn't belong beneath the Emperor's light. I believed it at first, because belief is easier than asking what kind of enemy requires secrecy from your own brothers. The orders came sealed in black lacquered tubes, stamped with sigils that burned behind the eyes if you stared too long. The briefing was short, delivered in a chapel that smelled of incense and disinfectant, as if they wanted the air itself to be sterile. Target classification, internal deviation, the robed officer said, reading from a slate without inflection. Directive, contain and excise. Secondary directive, narrative control. Narrative control. I felt the token in my pouch, cold, heavy, like it pulsed in agreement. We traveled in silence aboard a strike cruiser, whose corridors were narrower than the fortress, or perhaps only felt narrower, because everyone inside them carried the same disciplined dread. The ship's air tasted of recycled breath and machine heat. Vents rattled like teeth. Prayer strips fluttered on bulkheads as we passed, their ink smudged by years of gloved fingertips. Every few meters, an Auspex shrine blinked and chimed softly, acknowledging our armor seals and recording our movement. It was not enough to have warriors. The chapter needed receipts. When we made planetfall, no, not planetfall, contact with the operational zone, it wasn't a battlefield waiting for salvation. It was an imperial city, a hive-edge settlement, stacked habs and manufactorum towers rising into grey cloud. From above, it looked like any other, smoke plumes, traffic arteries like veins, shrine spires piercing the smog. There were no banners of rebellion, no void shields flashing, no enemy ships in the sky, just ordinary imperial life continuing under strain. The landing zone was a transit yard cordoned off by local enforcers. They looked small beside us, their armor scuffed and mismatched, their eyes too eager for approval, and too frightened to meet ours directly. Their commander approached with a data slate clutched like a relic, his voice trembling as he recited welcome protocol. "We are honored by your presence," he said. "The governor offers full cooperation." A brother beside me raised a hand. The gesture was small, but it silenced the man instantly. "Cooperation is assumed," my brother said. "Silence is required." The enforcer swallowed and nodded, face pale. Behind him, the workers in the yard stared at us from a distance, some crossing themselves, others simply frozen. They didn't know why we were here. They only knew that when angels descend, someone's life ends. Our first action was not an assault. It was paperwork. We established a containment perimeter and demanded access to administrative archives, population logs, transit manifests, servo skull recordings, shrine attendance rosters. The city officials complied quickly, desperate to prove loyalty. We took their records the way you take weapons from a suspect, firmly, without thanks, as if they were already tainted. A squad of us entered the central data vault, its doors sealed with local authority stamps that meant nothing in our presence. Inside, cogitators hummed in tall stacks, their lumen indicators blinking like nervous eyes. The air in the vault was cold and dry, smelling of dust, ozone, and the faint sweetness of old insulation. A servitor shuffled between terminals, cables trailing from its skull like dead tendrils. It did not look at us. It could not. It existed to carry data without understanding it, a fate that felt suddenly inviolable. We were hunting a person, but the hunt began by hunting traces. Names were flagged, associations mapped, movement patterns charted. We did not need to see the quarry's face yet. We needed to see where their existence had touched the system. Every transaction, every prayer attendance, every ration allotment left a mark. The Imperium's bureaucracy is a net, and we were tightening it. Then came the first purge, quiet, bureaucratic, surgical. A block of habs in the mid-level districts was sealed under quarantine for doctrinal safety. That was the phrase used on the public notice, printed in calm lettering and posted by enforcers with shaking hands. Residents were ordered to remain inside, doors were welded, ventilation was rerouted, water access limited. It was not a siege, it was an administrative measure. From the inside, it became a prison. We walked those corridors in full armor, our footsteps echoing off metal walls smeared with grime and devotional stickers. The air was hot and damp, thick with human breath and fear. People pressed into corners as we passed, families clutching each other, old men murmuring prayers, children staring wide-eyed at the weapons they could not comprehend. Their faces blurred together. In my helm, their heat signatures glowed like scattered embers. We were not here for them, I told myself. We were here for the quarry. The thought was supposed to make it easier. It didn't. We conducted door-to-door inspections, not searching for weapons but for knowledge. Picked captures, papers, unapproved symbols, personal journals, anything that suggested contact with forbidden history. Local officials tried to assist, offering lists of suspicious citizens, but we ignored their accusations. The hunt wasn't for criminals, it was for contamination, and contamination doesn't follow local politics. In one hab unit, we found a small shrine hidden behind a false wall. Candles burned low, their smoke staining the ceiling. At the center sat a crude icon, imperial in shape, but subtly wrong in proportion, as if carved from a memory that had been imperfectly copied. My squad leader didn't hesitate. "Size it," he ordered. A man thin, shaking, stepped forward with hands raised. "It's just devotion," he pleaded. "We meant no." My leader struck him once with the butt of his weapon, a clean, efficient blow that dropped the man without killing him. The man's wife screamed. The sound ricocheted through the small room like breaking glass. "No meaning is just," my leader said calmly. "Meaning spreads. We confiscated the shrine. We confiscated their candles. We confiscated their prayers." The report logged it all as minor doctrinal irregularity corrected. Outside, the city continued to breathe, unaware of the slow tightening around its throat. Our quarry remained unseen, but the operation escalated anyway, as if escalation was the only language the Imperium trusted. Entire manufacturing shifts were halted mid-cycle for verification. Workers were marched into processing lines where scribes and servitors scanned them, comparing biometric markers to lists they would never see. Those flagged were removed, hooded, and transported to an undisclosed location. The rest were ordered back to work immediately, fear driving output more reliably than any overseer. We seized the city's central Vox station next, not because it was a threat, but because it was a mouth. The Imperium cannot allow uncontrolled speech during a purge. We replaced local broadcasts with sanctioned hymns and calm announcements about stability. In the streets, speakers crackled with reassuring lies, while enforcers in formation dragged people into trucks. It was then I understood what we were really fighting. Not enemies, witnesses. Every time we arrested someone, we also seized their contacts. Every time we sealed a district, we also sealed its records. Every time we executed a suspect, we also incinerated anything they had touched. It wasn't enough to remove the quarry. We had to remove the possibility that anyone would know why the quarry had existed at all. The violence was clean and bureaucratic. Each action required confirmation codes, even when the consequences were immediate and irreversible. I watched a brother pause with his blade raised over a kneeling prisoner, not out of mercy, but because his authorization ping lagged. The prisoner trembled, eyes squeezed shut, whispering a prayer between sobs. The ping arrived. The blade fell. The report later described it as authorized termination of contamination vector. We finally found the quarry in a lower transit tunnel, hiding among the maintenance crews. They were not monstrous. Not a daemon. Not a warlord. Just a person, gaunt, filthy, eyes bright with frantic intelligence. They tried to speak when we cornered them, words spilling out in desperate fragments. You don't understand. This isn't. Listen, my squad leader fired once. Precise. The quarry fell. Silence returned. I stared at the body, waiting to feel relief, or righteousness, or certainty. Instead I felt only emptiness, and a creeping realization that the quarry had never been the true objective. The true objective was everything around them. We spent the next week cleaning. Civilians who had spoken to the quarry were detained. Those who had seen them were interrogated. Those who might have heard rumors were reassigned to labor camps. Data vaults were purged. Records rewritten. The hive's administrative history was edited until the quarry's existence became an accounting error. At the end, the city looked unchanged from above. Smoke. Spires. Routine, but underneath, whole blocks had been hollowed out. Families erased. Memories severed. And the official story, approved, stamped, repeated, said only that a minor doctrinal threat had been neutralized. That was when the full horror settled into me. Our greatest campaigns weren't for territory. They were for control of narratives. The Imperium fears enemies because enemies kill bodies. My chapter feared memory because memory kills obedience. And obedience, smooth, unquestioning, unrecorded doubt, was the only thing holding our secret, heavy world together. When we departed, the Enforcer Commander thanked us again, voice shaking with gratitude he didn't understand. My squad leader nodded once, indifferent. The ship lifted into the smog, leaving the city behind like a cleaned wound stitched shut over infection. In my quarters, I removed my helm and tasted the ship's recycled air. It smelled the same as always, oil, incense, metal, but now it carried something else in my mind, the ghost of civilian screams muffled by procedure, the quiet efficiency of erasing a person's life, and then erasing the fact you erased it. We had hunted a quarry. But we had really hunted the Imperium's own reflection. I did not learn the truth in a single revelation. The chapter does not allow that kind of clean understanding. Truth here is rationed in fragments, bled into you through stress fractures, tiny slips in a veteran's silence, a symbol you weren't meant to recognize, a prisoner's last words that land in your mind and refuse to die. After the hive operation, I carried a new kind of contamination, not disease, not heresy, but pattern. I saw it everywhere. In the way civilians were quarantined for doctrinal safety. In the way records were rewritten with calm efficiency. In the way my squad leader had killed the quarry before they could finish speaking, not because the words were dangerous as weapons, but because words are dangerous as connections. The chapter did not fear a single deviant. It feared what a deviant might prove, that our secrecy was not defensive, but necessary for survival. Back aboard the cruiser, my self-assessment slate updated automatically. New prompts appeared, more intrusive than the ones I'd been given as a recruit. List any unapproved symbols encountered. Describe any emotional deviations during termination procedures. Report any statements made by the contamination vector prior to neutralization. I stared at the final prompt for a long time. The quarry's last words had been broken, desperate. You don't understand, this isn't. Listen, there had been more in their eyes than fear. There had been recognition, as if they knew something about us, about what we really were, and had tried to throw it at us like a blade. I wrote the safe answer, no meaningful statements recorded. My thumb sealed the lie. The cogitator chimed acceptance. Somewhere, a ledger ticked forward and declared me stable. That should have soothed me. Instead, it made my stomach twist, because I knew what stability meant, not peace, not righteousness, just containment. Sleep became a battlefield. When I closed my eyes, I saw sealed doors and welded hab blocks. I smelled burnt flesh and incense mixed together, until I couldn't tell which was sacred and which was waste. I heard the prisoner's voice, not the words, there hadn't been enough words, but the urgency. the sense that he had been trying to hand me something I was not permitted to carry. Worst of all, I began to dream of missing names. Not names I'd ever heard aloud. Those would have been too obvious, but names that felt like empty slots in my mind. Places where knowledge had been removed so thoroughly that the removal itself became a phantom limb. I would wake with my jaw clenched hard enough to ache, my hands gripping the edge of my cot as if bracing for impact. The chapel incense started making me nauseous. That was my first real sign of danger. Incense is supposed to calm, to anchor you in ritual. It is a chemical leash, a sensory cue that tells the body to submit. When it began to sour in my throat, when it made my eyes water for reasons beyond smoke, I realized my mind was rejecting the comfort they'd built into the fortress. Rejection is deviation. Deviation gets corrected. I tried to fix myself. I did what loyal men do. I doubled my devotions, recited the litanies until my tongue went numb, forced my breathing into machine, like rhythm. I avoided conversation. I avoided eye contact. I avoided anything that might reveal the crack forming inside me. It didn't work, because knowing, even fragments, changes the way you listen. During drills, I started noticing veterans flinch when certain campaign numbers were referenced. Not fear, never fear, just a tightening in the shoulders, a brief pause before the next command. I began catching the way officers spoke in coded phrases around sealed topics, how they used doctrinal language like bandages to cover wounds they refused to expose. I saw how quickly they ended discussions when a recruit's question came too close to forbidden history. The fortress was full of people pretending not to know. Once you notice the pretense, the whole place feels unreal, like a shrine built over rot. The fragment finally reached me in a way I couldn't dismiss. We were assigned to escort a sealed reliquary from the cruiser's restricted vaults to a secure chamber planet's side. The container was heavy, rune, locked, attended by robed custodians whose voices never rose above murmurs. We were told the contents were doctrinally sensitive. No other explanation. As we moved through the ship's corridors, the reliquary's seals pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. The air around it felt colder. My helm's sensors registered nothing abnormal, and yet my skin prickled beneath the armor. I kept my eyes forward, repeating the litany of silence in my head. Then we passed an Auspec shrine. The shrine's display flickered as the reliquary moved by, and for a single breath, less than a second, a line of text appeared before the screen corrected itself, a designation string, an old one. Older than anything I'd seen in open archives. It wasn't a name. It was worse, a classification, stamped with the kind of authority that makes entire sectors rearrange their history. The words were too brief for certainty, but the implication hit me like a blow. This wasn't a relic of an enemy. It was a relic of us, of something within our lineage that had been sealed away, not honored, contained, monitored, feared. The display corrected itself immediately, replacing the string with a harmless devotional verse. The robed custodian did not react. My brothers did not react. We continued walking as if nothing had happened. But my mind did not correct itself. That one flicker connected too many gaps at once. The sanitation missions that erased symbols, the hunts that silenced witnesses, the interrogation chapel that calibrated minds, the way veterans treated certain histories like live explosives. We weren't guarding a secret to protect the Imperium from outsiders. We were guarding a secret to protect the Imperium from itself, from a stain in our origin story that could not be publicly admitted without cracking the image of purity that kept the chapter intact. If the wider Imperium knew, it would demand a judgment. Judgment would mean its scrutiny. Scrutiny would mean exposure. Exposure would mean collapse. So the chapter chose the only stable option, secrecy so absolute it became identity. That realization was the poison. Once it entered me, everything tasted different. Every oath sounded like a lock turning. Every sermon sounded like a cover story. Every act of zeal felt like compensation, not conviction. I began to wonder how many of us knew fragments like mine, how many carried partial truths like shrapnel lodged in the mind, too dangerous to remove, too painful to ignore. And then I saw what happens when someone carries too much. A brother broke, not in combat, not under enemy fire. He broke in a quiet corridor outside the chapel, where the lumen strips buzzed softly and the air smelled of incense and cold stone. He had been older than me, a veteran with scars carved into his armor and discipline carved into his posture. I had never seen him hesitate. That cycle he was shaking. It started in his hands. A subtle tremor he tried to hide by clenching his fists. Then his breathing became uneven, a stutter in the machine rhythm we were all trained to maintain. His helm was off, and his eyes looked wrong, too wide, too bright, as if he'd been awake for days listening to voices no one else could hear. He whispered to me as I passed, voice barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. Those words chilled me more than any battlefield ever had. Before I could respond, robed attendants appeared at the end of the corridor, as if summoned by the tremor itself. 2 servo skulls hovered beside them, optics wearing. The brother stiffened, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The attendants did not rush. They never rush. They approached with the calm certainty of procedure. "Brother," one said gently, "you are due for maintenance." Maintenance. The brother's mouth opened. For a moment I thought he would speak, truly speak, spill whatever fragment had shattered him. Then he saw the servo skull's lenses tighten. He closed his mouth. His shoulders sagged in defeat that looked almost like relief. They took him away without struggle. The next day, his designation was reassigned. His armor rack was empty. His absence was treated like a corrected typo. No one spoke of him. No one mourned. Mourning creates memory, and memory creates questions. That was the price of knowing, not punishment, not execution, but replacement. The chapter did not need traitors. It needed silence. If a vessel cracked, it was removed and swapped out. The secret remained intact. I returned to my cell that night and held the cold token in my palm until my skin ached. I tried to pray, but the incense made my stomach churn. I tried to sleep, but the flickering designation on the Auspex shrine burned behind my eyes. The fear stopped being external. It moved into my own mind, into the spaces where the chapter had taught me to keep things sealed. And I understood the final cruelty. I could never confess what I knew, because confession here wasn't forgiveness. It was deletion. The final assignment arrived the way all endings arrive in the Imperium, stamped, sealed, and framed as an honor. A servo skull delivered the slate to my cell at the 3rd bell, hovering in the doorway like a patient predator. Its lens blinked once, recording my face, then projected the directive onto the metal lectern. The text was short, unnervingly so, written in the precise administrative language that makes murder sound like maintenance. Assagiemi antiri ostioidiaion, locatio en sikostireki ombel elivel nuel, noti tashisisaelle, fe rdtfikion. My mouth went dry. Level 0 was not a place spoken of. It wasn't on schematics. It wasn't even hinted at in the gaps, because even gaps can draw attention if you acknowledge them. Yet I had always felt it, the way you feel a pressure change behind a sealed door. The fortress had a core. The fortress had a stomach. And now, apparently, it had decided I was ready to be swallowed. I prepared in silence, as trained, armor sealed, weapon checked, token secured. Each action performed with the calm precision of ritual, as if I could make this assignment less personal by treating it like any other. But my hands trembled beneath the gauntlets, faint and stubborn, and I hated myself for it. Tremors are measurable. Measurable things become evidence. The corridor to level 0 began behind a devotional alcove I had passed 1,000 times without noticing. That was the first insult of it. The reminder that the fortress hides its deepest truths in plain sight, trusting that discipline will prevent eyes from focusing where they shouldn't. I approached the alcove as the slate instructed, recited a litany that tasted like ash, and pressed my thumb to a hidden reader. The wall did not slide open dramatically. It simply unsealed with a soft sigh, as if it had been waiting all along. Beyond was darkness. Not the darkness of unlit halls. This was deeper, a blackness that swallowed lumen glow rather than reflecting it. My helm's optics adjusted, rendering the corridor in pale outlines. The air hit me like a cold hand, dry, chemically preserved, carrying a faint metallic sweetness that reminded me of Medica bays and sealed caskets. The door sealed behind me with a sound that felt like a verdict. The descent was long. Stairs spiraled downward, carved tight enough that my armor scraped the walls in places, leaving faint marks in the dust. There were no murals here, no prayers carved into stone, Only smooth surfaces and intermittent warning sigils etched so deeply they looked like wounds. Every few meters, an auspex shrine blinked and chimed softly, confirming my passage. The fortress was not merely letting me in. It was recording that I had been allowed to see what most never would. At the bottom, a final door waited, thick, sealed with layered locks and devotional seals that overlapped like scars. 2 robed custodians stood before it, faces hidden, hands folded. They did not greet me. They did not need to. Their presence was enough. One custodian produced a small vial. "Blood," he said. I offered my thumb without being asked. The stylus needle pricked, drawing a bead of warmth. The custodian captured it and placed it into a reader. The door's sigils pulsed faintly, as if tasting me. A chime sounded. Approval. The other custodian spoke then, voice soft and deadly. "From this point onward, you are not judged by what you do," he said. "You are judged by what you keep." The door opened. Inside was not a chamber, it was a tomb. The vault was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor divided into lanes of metal grating that ran between towering stacks of sealed containers. Some were data coffins, caskets of hardened plasteel stamped with forbidden classification codes. Others were reliquaries wrapped in chains and prayer strips, their seals layered so thick the original material was barely visible. The air was colder here, kept at preservation levels, and it smelled of oil, dust, and something faintly organic. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine, not the machine hum. A slow, wet rasp coming from somewhere in the darkness. My helm's optics swept the vault, searching. The custodians did not move, as if waiting to see whether I would break discipline by reacting too obviously. The sound continued, steady and patient. I followed it to the center of the chamber, where a structure rose from the grating like a shrine built from restraints, metal frames, cable bundles, sealed hatches. Servitors moved around it in slow, ritualized patterns, their augmetic limbs clinking softly. They carried tools and incense burners, alternating between maintenance and devotion without distinction. And within that structure, behind reinforced glass and layered seals, something lived. I could not see it clearly at first. The glass was fogged in places, smeared as if something inside had pressed against it long ago. But I saw enough, a shape too large to be human, too still to be dead. Tubes ran into it like roots, carrying fluids and data. Cogitator cables disappeared into its flesh, as if the machine and the body had agreed to become one. It was not a relic. It was not an icon. It was evidence, kept alive because death would end the chain of custody, and the Imperium hates closed cases. A living secret is easier to justify than a corpse you can no longer interrogate. My stomach lurched. The air tasted suddenly sweeter, like preservatives and old blood. The custodian's voice reached me, calm and clinical. "This is the burden," he said. "This is what must not be known outside these walls." I wanted to ask what it was. The question burned on my tongue. But I knew the price of asking. Questions create connections, and connections create confession, and confession here is deletion. So I remained silent. The custodians led me deeper among the stacks. They showed me containers labeled with classifications I couldn't pass, each one marked with warnings about unauthorized cognition. There were records of purges, campaigns, sanitation operations, like my first mission. Each one tied to the same core truth, each one filed and sealed so the chapter could pretend it controlled the narrative of its own sin. We stopped at a sealed station. A desk, if you could call it that, bolted to the grating and surrounded by cogitator shrines. The station held a slate waiting for my thumbprint. "Vault custody is not a duty," the custodian said. "It is a transformation." He gestured toward the slate. "You will swear the last oath." I looked down at the text. The words were simple and horrifying, and notis pak while not recordiotis tadia utrien, I when we remember duria wit permission, I while cotien, contain, the core of every oath I had ever taken, finally made explicit. And if I refuse? The thought formed in my mind, but my mouth did not move. My body already knew the answer. Refusal would be self-identification. The custodian's voice softened, almost gentle. "There is no refusal," he said, as if reading my silence. "Only 2 outcomes, containment or correction. Correction, the word that meant erasure. Replacement, the quiet vanishing of a vessel deemed unstable. I understood then that this was not a choice. It was a sorting. They had watched me for years, the chapel calibrations, the missions, the self-assessments, the silent tests of whether I could carry fragments without breaking. I had passed, not because I was pure, but because I was compatible. A container that could hold poison without leaking it. My thumb hovered over the reader. I could feel my heartbeat in my wrist. I could hear the wet rasp of breathing from the central shrine. I could smell incense thickening in the air as servitors swung burners in slow circles, sanctifying the horror like it was holy. I pressed my thumb down, the slate chimed. Approval, a new seal code appeared, my updated designation, now appended with vault custody markers. My world tightened instantly. I felt it like chains closing around my mind, new restrictions, new obligations, a life narrowed to a single purpose. The custodian nodded once. "You are accepted," he said. Accepted. Another lie shaped like kindness. I wasn't accepted into brotherhood. I was accepted into imprisonment. They did not let me leave the vault immediately. There were procedures, orientation, duty schedules, security routines. The custodians explained calmly how to log maintenance cycles, how to verify seals, how to process incoming relics without reading them too deeply. I listened and nodded, but my mind kept drifting back to the breathing thing behind glass, to the idea that the chapter's worst truths were stored in flesh and data alike, and I realized the final cruelty. The vault was not just a place where secrets were kept. It was a place where people were kept. Those who knew too much were not always executed. Execution is final, and finality invites investigation. Instead, the chapter buried its own dangerous knowledge alive, sealing it behind oaths and duty until the person became part of the infrastructure. A living lock, a breathing seal. That would be me now. Later, when my first custody shift began, I stood alone among the towering stacks, while the vault's machines hummed, and the breathing thing rasped behind its glass. My armor felt heavier than ever, not because of weight, but because it had become a cage I wore. I thought of my brothers above, training, fighting, praying, never knowing what lay beneath their feet. I thought of the ash miner, recruit who vanished for asking the wrong question. I thought of the veteran who trembled in the corridor and was taken for maintenance. I understood at last what the chapter truly was: not warriors guarding a secret, but a secret guarding itself through warriors. I make this confession knowing it will be sealed, maybe even corrected out of existence. Perhaps some custodian after me will find it and file it into the wrong stack by mistake. That is the only way truth survives here, through clerical error. In the end, the secret doesn't protect us. We protect the secret until it consumes us.